There is indeed a sound to every living thing upon this earth. A cloud at sunset, a tree, a flower, the growth of coral. They say that if our ears were fine enough tuned, that we could hear these many sounds as they circulate our airwaves. Of all the sounds that mix upon this earth, the sounds of poverty are among the cruelest and often lead to outward forms of discontent. This is Grenada in the 1950s. This is Resilience of the Spice Isle. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for joining us. Our first episode introduced the island's many parallels and ended with a discussion on the coming of Eric Gairy in the mid-1950s and his formation of a trade union and its associated powers.
The way that Gairy had become a politician was in this, almost in a Basmati type style. Very little party structure as such, but a popular labor leader who was able to mobilize mass of people effectively.
And what Gairy does is to turn that trade union power into political power. So he starts the Grenada United Labour Party. And it happens at a time when Grenada is now moving towards universal adult suffrage. So prior to this, if you own property, you got a chance to vote. If you did not own property, as was the majority of the population, you had no ability to vote. With universal adult suffrage coming in 51, Gairy now goes up for elections to the Legislative Council, and he wins the elections, hands down.
Barry Shaw, I would say, probably barely held on to his seat. Gairy was almost like a kind of a wind of change.
Gairy worked mainly in the rural community, but most of Grenada was actually almost rural. There was estates in the largest parish, St. George, Woodlands area, Belmont area, Springs, that is areas down in the south of the island, right throughout, particularly on the eastern coast, St. David and St. Andrew area. So the bulk of persons were working in agriculture. So you mobilize these people, and gradually they were able to earn some better working condition. And that struggle for the workers' right continued right through.
There was another political party which was more conservative, the National Party. Gairy was able to, defeat them in most elections. I mean, I know, for instance, in the early 60s, Gairy's party dominated the political process in Grenada.
So he became known as Uncle Gairy. There's a lot of mythology around him. He's an interest in political character. His followers became known as Gairyites. And even today you would hear people say, my father was a Gairyiite, or my mother was a Gairyiite. The women in the countryside used to say, Gairy taught us how to wear bra and panties. That even something as fundamental as that they may not have had access to.
Women in Grenada used to walk with long skirts, and it was Gairy that brought boots. So for the first time, women with boots. For the first time, they were able to walk with pants. They had to carry loads from far out. I'm talking about 3 miles with wet cocoa. Women had to carry that with basket to bring to the drying point. The thing is, you harvest the cocoa, you have to sweat the cocoa, then you dry it, and then you process it and then ship it out. That is what was being done. So when you harvest it on the estate, you had to bring it to those points where you can actually, what they call, sweat the cocoa. But Gairy then stopped that. He forced the estate owners to develop pathways where the distance was shorter, so women didn't have to carry those kind of load. So he did a lot for people.
And some people have referred to 1951 as a revolution, that Gairy basically changed the course of Grenada's history with the Sky Red in 1951. And even though he was criticized heavily by the New Jewel movement and the guys that formed the revolution, Bernard Court, who was the deputy prime minister in the PRG, has written about Sky Red, and now they actually crediting Gairy even though as the opposition to Gairy, they did not see fit to do it at that time, but they're now recognizing what Gairy did in 1951 in terms of the road that Grenada was put on at that point.
So he's basically at the forefront of Grenada's politics from 51 up to 79. He lost the elections twice, and that was because of naughty behavior on his, I'm going to say naughty, did voting commas, behavior on his part. He lost elections twice during that period, but he basically had the support of the people. He showed by trade union action that you can use a trade union to put pressure on plantation owners to be able to get wage increases, because once this happens in 51, you find other unions now coming to the fore and putting pressure, whether it was plantation owners, in some instances you have shop owners, so asking for things for like increase in wages of clerks, shop assistants and so on, starting putting that kind of pressure. So recognizing that you can use a trade union and you can, even if it's just to threaten strike action, these things can actually happen. So that was Grenada in the 1950s into the 1960s. Gairy is basically at the helm. He moves from winning the election, so he's part of the head of the Legislative Council, then he becomes Premier, and eventually he moves to Prime Minister, with Grenada asking for independence. So we would have joined the Federation like everybody else, and when Eric Williams says one best math problem in the world, 1 minus 10 equals 0. After that, of course, the Federation falls apart. We join the Little Eight, but that doesn't necessarily last. So Grenada becomes the first of the Windward Islands to ask for independence and to gain independence. But our move to independence was not smooth. All the other islands of the Windward Islands and Leewards as well had a gentle transition. Our transition was far from being gentle. With most politicians, somewhere along the line, there's always some naughty behavior and what I call very nicely political malfeasance. But you have it happening, and it would have happened in Gairy's case. So I think it's 57. He gets suspended because he basically sent a marching band through somebody else's bid for elections. So of course you're campaigning and he sends a marching band through the campaign. So he gets reprimanded by the British government. And it gets serious, more serious as time goes on. By 62, he is called up by the British government for misuse of government funds.
That was called squandermania. That was the name given to that. So what it was, through the course from 1951 on, there were different constitutional changes that gave more and more power to local elected officials and their participation in government. We still had an administrator and a lieutenant governor, but nonetheless we kept making these changes so we're local. So Eric Gairy, his party had won a plurality of seats, so they were in charge of the internal governance. And with that, they control finance and things like that. So in the course of that, I guess they had just designated Mount Royal as the Prime Minister's residence. So in going to and live in those residences, I guess he felt it had to have a certain standard. So he wanted certain things in there. So in the course of purchasing things for there, one of them being a baby grand piano, I guess the administrator felt that the process of acquiring some of these things were not in fitting with the procedures, that people were forced into signing off on things. So as a result of that, an investigation was started by the administrator, Lloyd, who was a Jamaican, Lloyd at the time, and he, after the investigation, concluded that there was corruption because procedures were not followed and stuff like that. So in that, he decided, the Gulf government at the time, the Grenada United Labour Party, which was running things in the ministries, He felt that they should not be left in control, so he squashed the constitution at the time and took over governance by the administrator, and whatever structures, the colonial structure, got back in place. And that period was referred to as Squandermania. I think it was coined by T.M. Arisho in his newspaper. In 1962, this happened. It wasn't the first time that Eric Gairy got into issues with the government, because he pushed the colonial structure, definitely. I think Gairy supporters definitely felt that it was a witch hunt, that there was an attempt to silence Gairy and to get him out of politics. And that's why these things were done by the colonial structure, because they were afraid of Gairy and the command he had of the followers and things like that. So Gairy was basically kicked out of office. And the opposition Grenadian National Party under Herbert Blaise came into power in that period. And in that period, we also had a push to join with Trinidad. Because there was a period when Trinidad, under Eric Williams, he wanted to bring St. Vincent and Grenada as part of a state. This was when the Little Eight was going on with Barbados, because Federation had just failed, with the one from 10 Leaves North, as Eric Williams put it, when Jamaica pulled out following their referendum. So Eric Williams decided maybe I could get St. Vincent, and what a lot of people don't know is that Eric Williams was actually thinking of bringing them on because they were predominantly black countries, and their black population would swamp the Indian population in Trinidad, which is, a lot of people are not aware that those were some of the machinations that were going on in the background, you know. And of course, nothing came of it, because even though Grenadians, they were ready, they were set. Grenadians actually called it the Go Trinidad movement. And they were on schooners headed to Trinidad. And there was a lot of backlash against all the Grenadian immigrants in Trinidad, even though Trinidadian society, one would say, was built by all these immigrants coming in. Trinidad did not have a population. Well, they had 3,000 people back in the 1770s when Grenadians started going to Trinidad. You know, Carnival in Trinidad is a result of all of the Grenadians and others who had gone there, because Trinidad became a French colony without a French governance, because of all these French who went there with their culture. And that's why today, you know, you see Trinidadian society and reflected from Grenadian society, and vice versa, of course. You know, so I think the Squandermania was an interesting thing, which I think we don't talk about much, because it just seemed like it was just a simple, but it really had all of these other consequences and things that were going on in all the islands, East of the Caribbean. You know, there was a Calypsonian that had a song about the thing with Little Eight and union with Trinidad, you know, and Gairy was more for Little Eight, because he felt that if he joined up with Trinidad, that Eric Williams would be the more dominant, whereas Blaise, who was the opposition, had actually proposed the union with Trinidad, and Blaise won the elections as a result. So yeah, it was one of those interesting episodes. Once Gairy got back, which of course Gairy used to get back in power, saying, hey, we didn't do the Trinidad thing. Gairy remained in power until he was overthrown after that. So after that Squandermania, Gairy came back to power stronger than ever. And he ended up winning the 1972 elections with 13 of the 15 seats, and he used that as a manifesto, on his manifesto, that we will get independence. And Gairy had said, I don't want to ask you for independence, I want you to give it to me. And they said, well, you need to show us that the people are behind you. So he did that in the 72 elections, and he's like, he took it as a mandate when he won 13 of the 15 seats. And when they tried to challenge him on that, he's like, dudes, I'm sorry, but I already beat you guys at the polls. I don't see what the argument is. And we ended up going to independence. So you can see how these other events, you know, contributed to the whole political scene at the time, and would influence stuff later on. His belief in UFOs, unidentified flying objects, became a laughing, joking thing, because he would go to the United Nations and advocated for research into UFOs. I remember a joke, a cartoon that appeared after the revolution, and they went to Mr. Gairy with the mic, and they said, we heard your government has been taken over, and the joke was it by UFO? So that was something that I think we sort of became a laughing stock from some people. And for anybody that's in power for a long period, I think you begin to see the flaws more than whatever good they may have done.
Even before he became Prime Minister, the decrease in the number, the hours worked, but the increase in labor, the building of many medical centers throughout Grenada, the building of playing fields. I think under his reign you had the most schools being constructed. So, and what probably distinguished Gairy from any other of the leaders since then is that his affinity and his embracing of the Grenadian culture or the Afro-Caribbean culture. To me, in my mind, he was the ultimate revolutionary, because I don't believe any revolution can be built on an ideology that is foreign. And Gairy, actually, he was seen encouraging the pan, embracing the drums, actually being involved with people that were, we call the Shango people, the Baptist people. So he was a champion of the people and he embraced the culture. I know of a situation where he actually used to bring drummers from Grenada to Carriacou and Carriacou drummers into Grenada. And because of his association with the people at the grassroots level, at some time he was considered too. And that was a slogan that was labeled at him, a propaganda slogan by the revolution, as an Obia man, because of his embracing of the African culture in Grenada. He actually led in terms of getting Grenadian scholarship, not just building and passing on secondary schools, allowing many, many young people to go to secondary schools, but also offering scholarship to places like even as far as Australia and Guyana to study agriculture, things like that. So he was a serious champion for the people cause. Under Gairy reign, we saw the greatest movement of wealth from the upper class to the poor people in Grenada. There has never been a period where there was so much transformation of wealth, both in terms of the acquisition of land and the building of houses, again, particularly after Hurricane Janet, which was not only his doing, because, you know, we got help from places like from Canada and, you know, after the Hurricane Janet to construct some of those houses, but there was major distribution of wealth under Gairy reign. So I think that is what I wanted to say in a nutshell, that plus a lot more that he contributed to Grenada. Maybe in terms of what I would call the psychological fortification of Grenadians and the Grenadian culture, he made them feel that they were equal to or as good as anybody else. So he challenged the status quo. He challenged the fact that only the Europeans or the white people or even the light-skinned people could get certain job. He was the one mainly responsible for breaking down that kind of barrier. So that level of psychological liberation, I would say, that Gairy brought to Grenada more than anything else.
He definitely was a Grenadian nationalist, and he wanted to promote, he wanted Grenada to change. You know, he was definitely anti-colonial, wanted to push, but then again, there was conflict within that as well, because he also wanted to be respected as part of Grenadian society, the top aspect of Grenadian society, the elite. You know, lawn tennis was his sport of choice. You know, we have lawn tennis courts that were built back then, you know. So there definitely was some things going on. That, was Gairy the revolutionary that he seemed to have been, or was he still conflicted with what role, you know, did he want to be? He would become Sir Eric Matthew Gairy. And one of the jokes during campaigns by the opposition, they would say, Sir Eric Matthew Gairy, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. They would give him the whole alphabet because he seemed to be concerned with titles. I think today we're still concerned with titles. I think we love the British Empire medals and things like that we get, you know. We have a local honors which nobody even knows about. But when it comes to getting on the Queen's or the King's, you know, list, I think that we're, despite the fact that everybody says, oh, I'm anti-colonial, but they all run for the big honors and things like that. So I think we definitely, like other islands in the Caribbean and other leaders, Gairy had a lot of those issues. To most of his followers, and a lot of people recognize his importance. People may not have liked him, the plantocracy and people who own property, because Gairy did certain things, like they had a land for the landless, where Gairy would appropriate properties from people who are on the other side, not on his side, and supposedly would give some of it to the peasantry and stuff like that, but some of it was kept, him among, and stuff like that, and some of it just kept in government. So government ended up gaining a lot of property through some of these supposedly legal, but none of that were not compensated for some of these properties.
Gairy came up against the status quo. When he came up against the status quo, remember in elections, a lot of times something had to do with who controlled the purse. And I also believe that there was a serious realignment, because he threatened the status quo. So persons that was generally inactive became active to try to push him out. And again, some people that took Gairy lightly recognize the challenge to the status quo. And I believe more and more people had things to lose, or had interest in the state to lose. They start galvanizing support and fighting against Gairy. I also believe, and not just believe from recording, that some of the estate owners and some of the business classes did a lot in actively campaigning to encourage their workers, you know, to try to vilify Gairy. So, and not only that, to vilify them in such a way that to paint him as one, a madman, to paint him as somebody that is extremely irresponsible. And I think not just the business class or the upper class, but when the revolution came, a similar thing was done in terms of Gairy not is somebody that is looking for his own interests. So one, he was always painted as a womanizer. He was painted as somebody that is acquiring wealth and etc. for his own aggrandizement. And so the business class combined with these revolutionaries, and the revolutionaries that were fighting for poor people, they found a sort of common bond to oppose Gairy on the basis that he is not right, he doesn't represent us. People that was not like generally willing to get active in politics, they were mobilized, and they now start seeing ways how to challenge Gairy. So of course, yes, at every now and then he lost some seats. I think the biggest or the greatest erosion from his support was in '76, after independence, because prior to independence, he was painted as this person that if he got independence, he would be a dictator. Look, he took land. I mean, there was a situation where Gairy entered an estate. He would then confront the owners and then get a number of workers and distribute land there and then. So there was some level of recklessness to what he was doing. So he was painted as somebody that if Grenada become an independent state, this man could just call for your execution. That was the kind of portrayal they had on Gairy. I mean, there was a classic situation, and the lady name was Miss Chataway. She owned an estate in Boulogne. Was a white woman, and she called him this black dog. Yeah, Chataway. She then left the island, and when she returned, Gairy said, "You can mash the soil." So for a prime minister at that time in the Caribbean to tell somebody white, "You cannot mash this soil anymore," and she had to return, go back to England. So it shows Gairy acquiring what we call some kind of dictatorial powers and utilizing that dictatorial powers. But what it did to black people to see that someone of the kind doing that. I mean, we have a program that we do at some time, and one of those ladies that were on the airport, she said, you know, people get panned, they jump, they this, because now Gairy was able to stop this white woman. But imagine the people from that ruling class recognizing that Gairy could do someone that, I mean, they were like, how can you do that? What constitutional power or authority allow you to do that? But he actually deported and sent her back. So When people say when there was this fear expressed about if he had come to independence, what he would do, there was some truth to the things he did. I mean, he went on estate, and as I said, he took lands, he distributed lands, and later on, people were then compensated. But again, on the other hand, he exercised some powers that, made people feel that very, very uncomfortable.
Despite this, Gairy is remembered as the man who envisioned the new airport at Point Salines. In fact, in the 1960s, he took a team, including his cabinet secretary, Gloria Bain Banfield, to True Blue. There he informed the team that the then swampy site was to be the home of the new airport. Many could not envision it. He brought Expo 69 to Grenada, so to St. George's University. Members of his government were said to have been visiting nations and examining the functioning of national insurance schemes with the view to introducing this into Grenada. He is also credited for introducing roundabouts as a means of easing traffic congestion, so too sidewalks as seen in the layout of True Blue.
In the 1970s, Grenada was very divided. George Brizan, the late Grenadian historian and Prime Minister, wrote and said that Grenada is an island of conflict. Coming out from the 1950s, right to the 1970s, there was a lot of tension in terms of an anti-Gairy movement that was formed. In the initial phase of his governance, he really championed the plight of the working class. But by the 1970s, he had changed drastically in terms of his style of governance. And there was a movement against his dictatorship.
Time comes when there was a feeling that Gairy was a bit oppressive, and people start questioning his record on human rights and respect for opponents.
And with a growing education, we had opposition, all of our opposition people got opportunities to go overseas, to go study, came back with these ideas, socialist ideas, wanting society, wanting more equality, wanted society to go in a different direction. And they felt convinced that they had answers that were not being pursued by the current status quo.
Well, join us next week at the same time as we continue our movement towards the overthrow of Eric Gairy in 1979 and the bloody demise of the revolution.